trusted partner in open source management.
We think that license complexity is getting crazier. Um, and there's five reasons why I think that is happening. The first one, we just looked at it. There's more and more code fragments or snippets being used, and that is going to affect the granularity of level of license compliance that we have to deal with. And look at license propagation and license compatibilities on a component level. It's already complicated enough. When you have to do it on fragment or snippet level, is even more complicated. But reason number two, which I think is really important, it is source available. And the increase that we see of companies using source available. And for those of you that are not familiar with it, source available is a model that follows the open source collaborative approach, but has restrictions. So as you know, open source, the definition of open source is that you can use the software for any purpose. But in this case, source available will not allow you to use the software for any purpose because you will have some restrictions, sometimes commercial restrictions. So source available looks like open source, but it's not. And there are many examples of this in recent years. We have MongoDB that went from AGPL version 3 to server-side public license in 2018. We have Elasticsearch that went from Apache to server-side public license and Elastic license version 2 in 2021. Actually, only to come back to AGPL in 2024. So that's an interesting case. It made a comeback to open source. I'm glad to see that. And we have the example of HashiCorp, with some of the software went from Mozilla Public License 2.0 to business source license. And that happened in 2023. And then we also have examples where open source projects like SemGrep and Redis they go source available, and as a result, the community decides to create a fork and continue a parallel track with an open source project. And for SemGrep, it was OpenGrep, and for Redis, it was Valky. So there was two projects created in 2024 that are forks with the effort of remaining or keeping this software development open source. They're an open source license. So source available makes license compliance complex. And why is that? Because first of all, it's kind of complicated to comply. When you're looking at source available, you have things like the Microsoft Shared Source License initiative, where you might have restrictions on what operating system you run the software on. It's only running on Windows. I know that some licenses have that restriction, so it's quite hard to keep track of the software that you might be using internally, and then make sure that it's only run under on a specific operating system. And obviously, when you go into source available that has commercial restrictions, then it makes it even more complicated because you need to make sure that you're complying with those obligations. Also, it can be complicated to understand. If you look at Commons clause, that is an addition that you can put on any open source license. It's been used mostly on Apache version 2, but as we saw the example of Neo4j, a Swedish company that used Commons clause on a GPL license. And you make an addition to an existing license, which it can make it a bit complicated to understand. And then the other reason why I think source available it makes license compliance complicated is because of what I mentioned before about forks being created. When we're doing audits, I know that I have seen sometimes looking at matches of code that could potentially come from the original project that went source available, or the fork that remained or it did a parallel track and continued with an open source license. And it's really hard sometimes to understand the origin of that code when it's been forked and it has two parallel tracks with similar development, at least for some time. So I think we would all agree source available, it makes license compliance more complicated. And here in this slide, we have to the left-hand side an analysis that we did recently where we went through a few hundred licenses, the licenses that we find the most during our open source audits, and we categorize them by different licensing models. So we have, as a not surprise to anybody, permissive being the most common type of licenses that we find. Then copyleft, both strong and weak, is also quite common. But it was very surprising to me that they were source available and source available with a specific non-commercial obligation uh, to account for 22% of the licenses that we see. That was a percentage that was much higher than I was expecting to see. So interesting numbers. And to the right-hand side, we have statistics from our open source audits where we've seen an increase almost doubled from 2023 to 2024. So companies are using more source available. I think the only reason that I can think of is that there's a lot of projects that are actually making that transition, as I mentioned. So that results in companies using more source available. And in the next slide, we have, as part of this prediction, license compliance gets crazier. I mentioned two reasons, and I have three more. The first one, we can see an increase on companies using copyleft over the years, especially from 2023 to 2024. And I think that's probably related to the fact that the maturity around using open source increases, which means companies get more comfortable using open source. And I've seen the transition. Some companies in the beginning didn't want to use copyleft, but they understand that it's much easier to comply than it is to avoid. So they start using more and more copyleft as a result. I think that might be related to it. Then reason number four is we see an increase on multi-licensed software. So dual license, three-way license, we see that trend also happening. There's more software with that type of licensing model where you have two licenses to choose from or three licenses to choose from. And we see that usage increasing as well. And in general, we just see at least a double of usage of open source in our open source audits from 2023 to 2024. And thinking of that, I think that's probably also connected to the fact that package managers keep bringing more and more packages to do a simple Hello World application. So I think package managers probably are part of the reason why we see this increase as well. So quick recap, we have increase in snippets, source available, copyleft, multi-license, and open source in general, which makes license compliance space more complicated. What do you say about this, Russ?
Great points, John, and you covered a lot of information here. So I'll just add a few brief points that I've observed in our practice. So I think as you mentioned, with the exponential growth in available software to use from package managers and AI generated code, so we're seeing combinations of many different pieces of open source that are being distributed together by various means. So, like as John was saying, when you combine these different pieces of open source, most often this creates a multi-license scenario, since each of the pieces of open source likely started with their own license for that particular component or piece. Combine them, and now you have several different combinations of licenses with different obligations that all need to be complied with. So from a practical level, what often happens is that developers are implementing these combined packages and perhaps only paying attention to what top level license is being stated for a given package or a given project. But then, we get in there, or the company's own OSPO gets in there with scanning tools, and then additional subcomponents and obligations are uncovered or identified, and all hopefully before the software is released.
Your trusted partner